Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Bree Adams. I'm from the Customer Success team here at Churn Zero, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar titled Unpacking the Value of the Executive Business Review. Before we get started, I'd like to remind you that we are recording this session, and a link to the recording will be available 24 hours after the webinar. Throughout the presentation, you're welcome to submit your questions via the question and answer box, and our staff, including myself, will try to answer them as we go. We'll also address as many as we can during the Q&A portion of this webinar, which will be right after this presentation is done. Now, I'm pleased to introduce you to today's presenter, Amy Mustoe. Amy is a principal consultant and coach at the Success League. Amy brings her clients the intelligence and training needed to scale their customer success efforts using proven strategies and personal experience. She's passionate about building highly skilled and engaged CS teams, believing that employee engagement and relentlessly customer-focused teams are critical to achieving the highest customer outcomes. Working in Saas Startups and the enterprise, she is known for advancing companies at various CS maturities in the areas of training, coaching, and process improvement. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Amy.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Bree. I am going to be talking about the Executive Business Review today. So I'm going to advance the slide here to begin with the agenda and what we're going to talk about today. So customer success is about helping customers obtain maximum value and seeing their expected outcomes. Using your product or service is really only a piece of the puzzle. So the executive business reviews are an opportunity to get that alignment with the key stakeholders that were probably part of the original sale. And hopefully when you did the handoff from sales to success, you understood what their goals and business outcomes were, you validated those. So this is about reporting back to the executive team on how did you do with the goals and business outcomes, and also a chance to learn about other initiatives and opportunities. So with the changing landscape, now more than ever, having those meaningful and relevant conversations about your customers' challenges and goals will be key to your company's success. So we're going to walk through a couple of different topics here. We're going to talk about what is an EBR and what other types of reviews are there. People use EBR, QBR, health checks. There's a lot of different meetings that you can have with your customers, but there's really only one that sort of is sort of on its own, which is called an executive business review, and it's really around who's attending the meeting, who's your audience. So we're going to talk about the right people that should attend. Should they be on-site or online? This piece, should they be on-site or online, may not be an option for you at this time. So we're going to talk about, when we can be on-site with our customers again. What does that look like? And then how do we take what we learned today and we really make it work online? What does it mean to do your homework? It's not just putting a slide deck together. Looking at what the customer goals are in order to have a validate a business review or have a relevant business review, you have to know what the customer's goals are. We're going to talk about what the agenda should look like and how the presentation should go. So that's what we're going to cover today. So what is an executive business review? So an executive business review is more of that formal strategic discussion with key stakeholders. So they are not necessarily the folks that you meet on a day-to-day basis or the ones that are the power users of your product. They're typically the buyer. What is in a business review? You're going to present the goals and outcomes that you have established with the customer. You're going to get a chance to learn about the customer's initiatives, maybe some new direction or opportunities. You're going to get a chance to ask a lot of questions. It should be focused on the data more, not so much ticket data or usage data, but focused on the data that validates the initial goals and outcomes they were looking for. And it should include a visual presentation, not just a discussion. But this is a great time to talk about what other types of customer reviews that may be mistaken as an executive business review or a quarterly business review. A lot of those things get sort of thrown around together of I think what we can say is that a monthly meeting with your main contact is not an executive business review. You're probably talking, more tactical, talking about usage or maybe new products. If it's a quarterly meeting where the executive stakeholders are not there, the buyers are not in attendance, I would say that that's not an EBR, right? So you want to have your executive stakeholders, your buyer, the person who's going to sign the contract, the person who really is sort of that higher level. It's usually your main contact's boss or boss's boss. Also, I wouldn't consider a standard contract renewal meeting in EBR. Are these other meetings important? Absolutely. And you should use some of the frameworks that we're going to talk about today on creating an agenda and what's included. You should have these standard meetings really mapped out as to, in a monthly meeting we want to cover this, in a quarterly meeting where the executive stakeholders aren't there, we want to cover these items. Same thing with a contract renewal meeting. That may have a different agenda, but we're going to really focus on the EBR today. So what should be in that review? So we're going to talk about who should attend. And how I think about this is, from an internal standpoint and from a customer standpoint, who are the right people to attend an executive business review? I think part of it has to do with where you are in the process. If you're still in the onboarding process, you might have a slightly different folks that are in these meetings. So if you're in the middle of onboarding or haven't fully deployed, you might have like professional services or the implementation team or the executive on the side of the customer that is concentrating on onboarding and getting live, right? Once you are live, and you might change who's attending. So an example is you might have a budget owner or a buyer who wants to learn more about the product or wants to meet the VP of engineering or wants, maybe adding from your side, engineering and product is going to be more effective once the customer's live than during the onboarding period. So during the onboarding period, they might care about slightly different things and your attendees could be different. So I think really looking at who the players are, what stage your customer is in the maturity sort of with your company will help you decide exactly who might be the right folks on each side. But definitely the CSM and executives from your company, and most likely sales. And then on the customer side, you definitely want your champion, your main contact, your budget owner. And then also, one of the things that I find is that sometimes working with your day-to-day contact, you can get a better understanding of really what their executives are expecting and who should attend from their end, because they're going to be closer to that than you. So definitely lean on your main champion or contact that you work with every day to help you decide who the guest list should be. Will it be important to have their counterpart at your company attend this meeting, or do they not really think that that's valuable? So don't be afraid to ask questions around that. So on-site or online. So this is usually a big discussion that usually is around, how big is the customer? Are they strategic? Do we have budget? Does it support those travel expenses? If I'm on site, will I be able to do things like take the customer out for a social activity? Will there be options for, sort of expansion or selling? can include some time to do like on-site training. Those are usually some of the questions that you have to ask yourself as to whether you would spend the money to go on site. At this point, I would say that, you're not probably in the next 30 to 60 days or longer, you're not really making that decision. You're going to do these online, and this is a good exercise for, really improving what you already do today. If you have a format or a template, or you have the metrics that you share, how can you make it as valuable as you can, from an online perspective? So again, even though you're not necessarily making the decision right now on site or online, once sort of things get back to normal, we're all hoping that we'll be, face to face with our customers again and be able to make that decision. And that's how you would kind of decide on your decision. I guess the biggest thing is, make the most of your on site. If you're going to spend the money and you're going to go visit customers, just make sure that you're using it to the best of your advantage. Doing your homework. So, CSMs, in order to really have a meaningful conversation with executives, is you need to do homework about the company. So, who, what, and why, and how of the customers they serve. I would say that's your general. You want to know, what is the company profile? Who are the main sort of players? What products and services do they provide to their customers? Why, what is their mission? What are their business drivers? What are their key metrics? So really trying to understand the business model or the business strategy of the customer is going to be key. What is their go-to-market approach? What's their pricing model? Now, again, you might not have to know every single piece or be talking to the executive about every single piece there, but it really gives you the confidence that if something comes up, or maybe you ask a question, the executive answers a question, if you've done your homework and you really understand the customer and their business and how they're measuring success, you're going to be able to have a much more meaningful conversation with an executive versus just talking at them with a bunch of slides. So how do you do your homework? You can look at internal sources and external sources. It may seem totally obvious, but the best place you can start is the customer's website, and really understanding how it is that they sell their product, what is important to their customers. And the second biggest piece of, is, your user data. So do you have data? Some customers, all the data comes from the product, and it's very easy for you as a CSM to present value and usage and outcomes. But a lot of the times it's not that way. There's some product usage data, because again, remember that I said at the very beginning, success isn't about using your product, it's what using your product does for their company and the outcomes that they're looking for. So it's usually a combination of some sort of internal resources, external resources, that you're going to be looking at to come up with this overview or sort of synopsis of the who, what, and why of how the customers they serve. So I find that being able to look at a lot of the internals, so the support tickets, the health score, the CSAT and the NPS scores, the engagement activities, those are all things that can help you frame the conversation. But definitely do research on social media, Crunchbase, like have they just gotten funding, a lot of different things. You don't want to miss an obvious thing and not bring it up of what might be going on with the company. And in this sort of landscape, I think really understanding the company's business model and their profitability model and how they make money and who they sell to can help make these conversations that you need to have with customers, whether it's in an executive business review or you're reaching out to all of your customers at this period of time and trying to understand how can we help you. What are you struggling with right now? All of those things make a big difference if you know. I was amazed in really talking to folks sometimes who don't really understand who their customers are, and really what they build, what they use, what they who their customers are. So be that sort of inquisitive CSM and really do your homework. So customer goals in the EBR. So for those of you that have taken the class called Customer Goals and Outcomes, this might look familiar. The Success League covers, it's the first class in our series and our certification that really talks about sort of the backbone of, how do you get started building these relationships, these proactive consultative relationships? Well, you start by talking about the goals. And then when you come to the EBR, you're able to talk in the same terms that you spoke about with the customer at the beginning. Excuse me, you review the performance against the goals that you've discussed. So for those of you who haven't taken the class, if you don't have a formal way that you present back metrics and goals and results to your customer, you should decide on something as a CSM team. All use the same things. The goals should be SMART, so specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. Because again, just saying, hey, I want to increase revenue is not the same as saying, I want to increase revenue to 1.2 million next quarter, and we're going to measure it over, over quarter, and we want it to go up 15%, something like that. So again, by putting actual SMART goals in place, you're going to be able to measure those goals. So, what it does is it also, by presenting this as part of your EBR, it keeps the discussion strategic rather than tactical, because you're not going to necessarily have, a customer goal that is something like, 50 out of the 100 of your users are using the product. Like that's a usage, that's just a usage statement. It's not a real goal of the business, right? So you're keeping it strategic rather than super tactical. You're keeping it at that business level, outcome level. And then of course your product supports that, but you're not talking about your product. You're talking about actual business, like say outcomes 100 times, but actual business takeaways, right? Of really what your product has helped to do. And this is a way for you, think about if you're working sort of with your day-to-day contact, and you guys are putting together this presentation that is then going to be given to executives and presented. This is a way to help your main contact look good. Like some of the people that you'll work with, whether it be at the executive level or your main contact that you're working on this program with, they may have never even put goals together. They just know that they're using your product because it should save them time, or it should make them more money, or it supports their mission. They may not, don't assume that they know how to put SMART goals together. Those are the types of things that you can bring to the table as a professional consultant to help them. Like if you can help them look good to their boss, like how awesome is that? That is what you should be shooting for, is that you are giving them a value add. And I think too much we put the onus, or at least we expect that the customer can do all of these things on their own and they know how to do it, but you have to help them measure performance. You have to be a part of that, or else you'll be at a place where you're at a renewal and nobody can say, the value, quantify the value that you've brought to the company over the last 12 months. The other thing that I like about this is if you create a format like this or something similar, if you get a new champion, and all of us have been there, like it's hard enough to, keep customers happy and keep, retain them. And then your main contact who you have a ton of rapport with leaves. And now you're trying to almost resell to the new contact. And if you don't have any results and goals that were set, quarter over quarter or year over year, you're not able to instantly show value. Like, these are the things that we decided as a team together that we were going to accomplish, and here's how everybody performed, and this is what we're working on next. So being able to support your main contact and executive contact with these types of details is invaluable. Because if not, then they're going to be sort of scratching their head and probably not even talking to you about, do they really need to renew their contract? Where am I really getting value? So the agenda. So this is where we talk about what should be in the business review, the executive business review. And what I usually say is, for all the other reviews that we talked about, which was, sort of a monthly review, a renewal review, maybe it's a save customer review, there might be different agenda items. And this is where you can kind of take this as a template and say, I'm going to build this for every type of important meeting I have to have for a customer, and use the same kind of thought process and format. For this one, we're definitely going to talk about the executive business review, because that is the one where we really want to dive deep. So what you want to have, everything above the line, the black thick line, you want to make sure you have an introduction, you have any project updates if they're in the middle of a project or a deliverable, and your goals and outcomes. Plus, anything below the black line at the bottom, you want to have time for Q&A, action items and next steps, scheduling your next EBR. Lots of what you want to do is pick 3 to 4 items in the middle. And you may have, I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, but you want to have the types of information. You're not there to show them necessarily a deep dive into new products, right? You don't want the show to be stolen by the sales rep that wants to expand into another area. That's an important meeting, and you uncover that maybe at this meeting, but this meeting needs to be about the wins and the feedback and where the customer's going. And you want to be able to showcase all the great things and the impacts that you have made, your product, the day-to-day team at your customer, all of the things that you feel are the reason why they use the product, and that they're getting value every single day. So you don't want to get too far off on like roadmap items or how much customers are actually using the product. You can touch on those, but you don't want to dive deep. You want to dive deep on the wins and the feedback. The customer initiatives discussion. This is where you validate, are these still the goals for the year? So again, this is going to be front and center for a lot of you, is that when you get on your next EBR, I would promise that the customer initiatives that you talked about with your customer on January 1st are not the same today. They are now different. And you've got to ask some questions around that, right? You've got to ask, these were the goals. And even if you've never had a meaningful discussion about goals, I mean, now's the time to ask questions and actually, create that initial, what for the next quarter are the main drivers of your team, of your, is it, keeping your customer base? Is it, trying to pivot into a different sort of way of looking at things? Is it to logo retention? Like, what are all those things? And then by asking those questions, you're going to be able to then help guide the customer on where you and your product or service come into it. This is where also you add in best practices, like things you've learned over the years, things you've learned about how they use your product or service that can help them. Any recommendations? So recommendations, definitely, do you want to roll it out to more end users? Do how are other customers using things, and how could this customer see? So these are the types of things where you're going to be looking at how can you impact any of the other problems or issues that they've brought up. What do you suggest that they do next to maximize the product usage or the value? This is the time that you might talk about new opportunities, or it may or may not be a slide, but these are the types of things that you want to make sure that you talk about. Even the solutions roadmap. So what does that look like? If the customer has been waiting for a new feature to come out, maybe you're not giving them the entire roadmap, because this isn't a roadmap discussion. This is a discussion about how you're bringing value and bringing a consultative approach to your relationship. So you want to be very tight in how you talk about different features, or if you want to talk about the roadmap, it would probably be things that are really going to increase the value or usage of your product or the customer's been asking for. So the whole idea is to not have too many slides with too much sort of just regurgitated graphs and information. This should spark conversation, meaningful strategic conversation. It should not be about a ton of content. So what about the presentation? You might find it interesting. I recently attended a CS meetup, and the panel contained some end customers on the panel. And what we found is that some of the questions that were asked about whether customers found executive business reviews value to them. And what they pretty much said is that they hate business reviews and they go out of their way to avoid them or not be in them. And the ones that they really liked were the ones that provided strategic discussion points. So it really was thinking and acting and being able to speak to those higher level business goals of not just your product and features and usage. So really making sure that you're going up to that higher level discussion with your customer. So it's also proven that 60% of adults are visual learners. So you always want to make sure that you've got a visual presentation, but it shouldn't be hundreds of slides. So the rule of thumb is 1 slide per 5 minutes. And if you've got 30 minutes, you divide that by, and you get 6 slides, right? 6 times 5 is 30. Okay. So if you get 30 minutes, you get 6 slides. So try to think of it that way and be very meaningful about what you include or what you take out. It would be ideal if you create this template that includes all the possible agenda items, and people sort of use it as a menu, right? Like where you're like, okay, for this customer, these 5 things are important. So if we pop back here, so you might have a menu of all items that you get with your CS team, and you guys agree that these are the main items that we should be using for this type of business review. Then you can go in and make it very easy for the CSMs to pick and choose different parts of the presentation based on exactly where that customer is. And then you definitely just want to keep things consistent and simple. I've been in executive business reviews before where it was like, somebody had to talk so fast through every slide. I think there was 100 in the last one that I sat through, 100 slides, and it was like it was not super effective. So really, really spend time with you and your team and trying to figure out how you make the most of that time. And sometimes you can get, if you can make it very succinct and very strategic driven, you might only get 30 minutes of an executive's time, and don't assume you have a whole hour. Sometimes if you can, do the tactical stuff with your main contact for the whole hour and then just ask the executive, could they just be there for the 30 minutes? Sometimes you'll get more takers versus trying to get them to schedule a whole hour. And just remember, you're trying to establish credibility and influence people at this point and influence an executive. And so, you really need to have an executive voice, and it takes a little time. So if you can sit in on executive business reviews with your peers, or someone who's done this before, or, have someone, such as your manager, or if you've never done one before, do the first one, because it matters, what you say, how you say it, when you say it. So those are sometimes cues that are a little bit harder to pick up on. But I think, again, it's that experience. It's talk to your team members, ask them, can I sit on your next business review? Can I look at your slide deck? How do you usually attack this? So definitely use your own peers as help. And then another thing to do is, you can take this away, go back with your teams, and you can do some role playing, right? You could, we find that we do this entire this executive business review as a workshop, and we do a lot of time together where we're figuring out what needs to be in the executive business review, how do we conduct it, how do we create that executive presence, all of those types of things. And we break out and we do role playing, and it's a way to get that experience without sort of cutting your teeth on, actually just, jumping in there with 2 feet and doing it. It can be really helpful. So following up on the EBR, so I would say the most important thing is to never leave an EBR without scheduling the next EBR. So that one is important because it gets a buy-in, because it's going to be another 3 months or 2 months or 1 month or 6 months, however often you do these. Getting that executive to say, yeah, like I'd like to do a follow-up in 2 months, or it allows you're getting permission to get on their schedule. And whether they've got an executive assistant or, your main contact is helping you schedule it, it means you're allowed to get this on the schedule, right? Discuss the agenda items. Were the agenda items that we talked about this time valuable? If not, what would we like to do? Any other determining next steps. So any sort of data that you need to follow up with, how do we move the project forward if they're in the middle of kind of onboarding, any follow-up meetings. And then I think the saying thanks piece, whether it's a thank you note, sending a copy of the presentation, think of something that could also set you apart, like mailing some sort of swag, like if, that's just for the executive business review, or something that is just a little bit more personal. So maybe a handwritten note. And, depending on your company, maybe you're a t-shirt company where you send t-shirts, or you send a nice pen, or you send something, a book, like, there are lots of different ways to kind of, step out and be a little bit original. So there's some additional resources that and everybody will get, this is being recorded and everybody will get a copy of the presentation. But we like some of these resources. There's a book called Farm Don't Hunt, and It covers some proactive nurturing activities that can help when you're, trying to supplement account reviews. And then there's an account review PowerPoint template called Preact, or account review template done by Preact, and it's a clean, simple format that you can use as a model for your own account review. Just another example, if you want to. There's a lot of examples out there. I think the idea is just make it your own. And then we've got one of our advisors that from the Success League, Ashley Hall, and she did a really good blog post on delivering excellent quarterly business reviews. And there's some really great information in there that I think it's a quick read. It's super insightful. And I would just say in closing that whether you can get in front of the executive or not, having meaningful conversations right now with your customers about what's changed in the landscape, what their goals are, how you can support them. Those are going to be super meaningful conversations that will lead you into an executive business review in the future. But if you're not doing these formally now, I mean, start by just talking to customers in a very consultative way about what they're hoping to achieve short and long term, using your product. How can you help them? I think having that conversation is really important. And then hopefully a lot of these ideas you can incorporate into your formal presentation with your customers on, again, there's no, whether you do it quarterly or biannually or even monthly, depending on how large your customers are and how many players there are. Sometimes there's a need to have these monthly, but we see most people having them quarterly or biannually. And definitely not waiting until you're trying to get the renewal. That is probably the most precarious time to, 3 months before the renewal's coming in to try and present this type of data. So that wraps up my side of the presentation. And so I think Bree's going to help me now understand maybe what questions we've had come from the attendees.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that presentation, Amy. So we've had a couple of great questions come in, but I'd like to invite anybody else, please go ahead and submit your questions via the question and answer box. For our first question, which is one that I thought of myself actually, let me pull this one up. So what do you do if it is proving very difficult to actually get your executive to attend an EBR? Do you have any tips to try and get that buy-in?
Sure. There's a couple. One of the first ones is, and this is always the ideal one, is try and make sure that that executive relationship starts at the time of the kickoff. So making sure that sales is bringing the right people to the table when you kick off the relationship, and you start having those goals and outcomes discussions at that time, so that when the 3 months comes up, you have a lead into, when we met at the kickoff, we talked about these goals that your team has. I'd like to, show the results of those goals, see if anything's changed. It can open that up. Now that's like in a perfect world. And so for your next account that gets handed off to you from sales, just do it right from the very beginning and set sort of that expectation. We're going to have quarterly meetings. These are the things that we'll cover. Do you want to add anything to it? Is it too much, too little? So that's like perfect world. Now you've got, all CSMs have been in the place where they've inherited a book of business. The salesperson doesn't even work there anymore. You don't have any notes in Salesforce as to why they bought your product. I think you start with your main contact, right? You need to get them to buy into why you both need the executive on the phone, like what you're trying to do. And again, don't assume that your main contact understands the value of having that type of discussion with their executive. You want to help them get to a place where they're looking good in front of their boss. So you want to help them be able to articulate the value of using your product in their program. And so if you can get buy-in from them, usually they can talk the executive into spending the time with you to learn about the learn about the value and that they're getting from the product and all the good outcomes. But there's going to be customers that don't want to do an executive business review. The executive is checked out. They'll pay the bill. You mainly just have your main contact, and that's okay too. Like, don't beat your head against the wall. If they don't see the value in it, you can continue to try. But at some point, sometimes you just can't get the executive in the room.
That's really helpful. I have another question about some sort of timelines, and it's kind of twofold. So the first part, I know you mentioned, maybe it's 2 months, maybe it's 3 months, but do you have a golden rule for how often you should be looking to do EBRs?
I think part of it is what the customer expects, and also what you can afford to do. So typically when you start talking about executive business reviews, you've talked about already gotten to a place where there's only certain segments that get business reviews, right? Maybe it's a certain revenue, a certain type of customer. Are they strategic? Are they our highest paying revenue? If you have 30,000 customers, you can't give them all executive business reviews, right? Maybe you're only giving your top 1%. So I think understanding also during the sales process and how, what type of customer it is and how integral you are to like their day-to-day, it it may lend itself to the fact of we need to do these quarterly, or if you're a very small vendor in sort of the big picture, then the executive's time is very, very limited. It might be that you're super excited just to get 2 times a year that the executive will talk to you. So I think it's a little bit of how you have segmented your customers and who gets a business review, right? And then the other is, what is the expectation from the customer? Do they want this type of high touch?
Perfect. So kind of talking about those high expectations, what if we have a customer who's actually been with us for a really long time, maybe a couple of years, and we're just trying now to implement this process? How would you suggest we go about aligning their expectations now, introducing this EBR process?
Sure. There's a couple of different ways that I've done this. And one is to, you know, tout it as a new value add. We're changing the way that we want to support our customers or want to make sure that we're aligned. We know that the only way for us to be successful is if we're in alignment with our customers. These are the types of things that, because again, you want it has to be what's in it for them. You are showing that you're a valuable resource, you understand their business, that doing these executive business reviews are getting them what they need. So I think even being able to get in a room or get on the phone and have a conversation about, you as a company, where can you help lift up their business, and ask some of those questions. Another one, we have a class, an online class called Asking Great Questions, and that is an awesome way of looking at asking the right questions so that you get the right responses. And I think a lot of those ways are really good tactics to get folks engaged and want to have a stronger, more strategic relationship with you. Just because they haven't before doesn't mean they wouldn't be open to it. So I think, being able to put some of that stuff in front of them as to what's in it for them is going to be key.
That makes a lot of sense. So we have a couple of questions coming in about the difference between doing a EBR with a higher touch model versus a lower touch model. Do you have any advice on how to maybe use automation to do EBRs so that you can do it at a greater number to provide the value to your lower touch customers, or tech touch, or anything like that?
Sure. Yeah. And again, EBRs typically are for more of the enterprise, just because they're typically a higher touch, and it in the past have been more where you're literally talking to the executive. So in order to use this at a higher scale, whether it's called a health check review, maybe you're not calling it an executive business review, right? But it is providing valuable information to a customer. So really looking at how did I put my executive business review together? How do I then take groups of customers that fit that profile, but maybe they're smaller and they're not high touch? How do I provide some of that same information? Maybe it's best practices, it's pieces of the product that they're not using, all coming out in an automated way, right? Like, providing health checks to the customer on a quarterly basis with a link to a webinar, right? There's a lot of different ways to get customers more engaged, using more of your product. Possible training options, right? Meeting groups like in a webinar. So I think there are a lot of things, but I think what you do is you work backwards. You think about the more high touch EBRs, and then you think about, how can I make that lower touch? How can I make that a one-to-many approach where I'm not necessarily, and a lot of it sometimes is technology, right? And so you have to figure out, how can your technology support, because you might not be able to ask the customer what their outcome is expected to be, but you're going to have to make an assumption that you want to increase revenue or you want to save time. And so that's what you need to be reporting back to this customer. You're going to have to make an assumption that that's, so instead of asking all those probing questions, you're having to make some assumptions and provide some meaningful data and guidance where you're still being seen as a consultative arm of in one of my roles, I had a very high touch model and a very low touch model, and we worked closely with marketing, so customer marketing, to figure out how we keep some of those meaningful touch points in a place where we were still providing meaningful data and ideas for customers to improve their business, but it wasn't on a one-to-one basis. So sometimes you can engage marketing to help you figure that out as well.
Excellent. We have a couple of questions coming in about like, what if you have just inherited the account, or what if you actually just got a new main stakeholder who doesn't know what the new goals are or what the old goals were? Do you have any tips for how to kind of introduce the goal setting conversation and make yourself look knowledgeable of their business while also trying to get them to answer all of these new questions?
Yeah, well, that's really good. So I think there's a couple of things. One is if you've been using a standard format of goals and outcomes over time, it's an easier conversation to get somebody on the phone to say, hey, I want to get you up to speed about the accomplishments and the goals that we've been working on with your team, and really get your input on what you'd like to see in the future. So that's like best case, right? Where, I mean, I would be surprised if they wouldn't want to get on the phone and have a discussion. Picking up the phone and saying, hey, you're my new contact, I'd like to chat, is not as meaningful, right? I mean, it would be great if you could say, I want to review the results. That's probably the most meaningful. But a lot of people, I would say, are not in that situation. They've inherited, they've walked in, they're a new contact, and you don't really have a lot to share with them about maybe the goals and outcomes of the last 2 years. I think that's when you do a lot of research about the customer and the company, so that you can provide the most meaningful conversation that you're able to without really understanding the goals. You can do a little high level of, as I understand it, the company, although you weren't there at the time, purchased this product to do X, Y, and Z. These are the places where we're super valuable. It becomes almost more of a sales, I wouldn't say sales presentation, but more of a higher level value presentation. And then you can ask some of these probing questions, like, is that valuable to you? We find our customers, are trying to measure this, this, and this, and we come in this place. So talking with authority, even though you may not have all the stats and data because you haven't been tracking it. I wouldn't shy away from really trying to just get in front of them and ask some of those questions. And you don't have to ask 100 questions, just ask a couple on the first call and get to a place where at least you can get a second call with a couple of goals on what they're trying to accomplish. How can you help them as a new leader in this organization with tracking the progress?
So what if the company you're working with and you're having this EBR, what if they have not met their goals? How should you approach that, or should you even approach that differently than if they had met their goals?
Yeah, I think you need to hit it head on. One is that we usually suggest, and this is in that customer goals and outcomes class, but we usually suggest 3 to 5 goals. You never want to have just one goal. You would like to have 3 or 5 goals, and there's a lot of questions that you can ask around. Most goals are structured around revenue and time, and there's a lot of other goals out there: employee satisfaction, customer mission, branding. There's a lot of other things that can be goals versus just revenue and time goals. But you want to, be able to, one, champion or celebrate all of the good things, but you don't want to shy away from the ones where you've missed the mark, because you may not really even understand fully why the goal, the business outcome, so it's not just the product, right? There's a business outcome that was missed. Why was it missed? Is there something you don't understand, or did some goal change? Did they have turnover on the team? Like what was the reason why they think that? So asking a couple of probing questions around that. And then it may have just shown that the goal was too overzealous, right? It was too, you need to back off. And it's the same thing if it's all green. If you're making all the goals all the time, they're blowing through them, then you need to, as a CSM, you need to encourage them and push them to push themselves to do even better and do even more. So but don't shy away from it. Hopefully, you've got some green and yellow and red, and you can talk, have meaningful conversation. But yeah, don't shy away from it.
That is excellent. So I am going to ask you a couple more, but then I'll let you go. Here's a question that I actually experience every once in a while, where we don't necessarily have an executive sponsor identified, and it's a bit of a challenge trying to get one in. Maybe we're working with a director, and we'd like to be working with the VP or something like that, or CEO. How do we encourage the team that we are working with to get the value to bring in that executive sponsor?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is that you might want to entice them by, hey, I want, in order for this program to be successful overall, I would like my VP to be in the room with your VP to build that additional relationship. I can see how that would value us in the XYZ, right? Like if, so again, showing the your main contact where that value comes in, even talking about being able to talk about where you can help them show the value of the program, and then showcase you know and I don't want to say make them look good, because you don't want to say it like that, but that you really you want to be a partner with them in showing the value of the program. And if you could work together and be able to present that to the executive, that you think it's a value. So you almost have to get your, well, you do have to get your main contact you to see the real value of um, getting the executive involved. That you're trying to showcase, or that you're trying to help them showcase all the good work that was done, and feel like if we don't involve the parties from both sides, that we're leaving something on the table.
Okay, that's awesome. One last question. Do you have any sneaky tips for investigating our customer, whether it is the human being or the business, that we should look into before we have these? Like, should we be spying on them on LinkedIn or connecting with them, or anything like that?
Yeah, I definitely think spying on them on LinkedIn is good. Um, I I think connecting with them on LinkedIn is good. You know, most if you're a vendor or you're a customer of a vendor, most of the time, like I'll usually, I'll friend somebody on LinkedIn. Like I don't think that it's an intrusion at all. I do think doing your homework as far as looking at where you can talk intelligently with that executive about the business. Where's the business going? Who's your customers? Who's the, who, what, why, and how of the customers that they serve? Showing that you're asking meaningful questions versus just, well, what's your goal for the quarter? Like asking something about, I can see X has happened in your business. Like, how does that affect, you know, I mean, like, in today's world, it would be, I see that your business model is X, and with now people working from home, like how is that affecting, your business model or how you interact with your customers? It's asking those meaningful types of questions that show you understand their business and you're going to provide value to them, not just you know, uh, keep them happy from a customer support perspective. That you're really like sort of a value add.
Awesome. Well, this has been amazing. We do have a couple other questions coming in. Thank you guys for being so incredibly active, but I want to remind you all again that the recording of this webinar will be sent out within the next 24 hours, as well as the slide deck, so a PDF of the slides. At the end of this webcast, you will see a survey pop up, so we'd appreciate if you guys could take a minute before logging off to complete the survey, provide your feedback. Thank you all so much for joining us. Amy, thank you so much. This was absolutely fantastic. This was great. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much.